In the heart of Tudor England, where power was absolute and loyalty could turn to death overnight, a single woman dared to stand against the tide of kings and courtiers. Her name was Anne Boleyn, a woman whose wit, charm, and defiance reshaped the destiny of a nation. She rose not from royal blood, but from intelligence and ambition, capturing the heart of Henry VIII and the imagination of England itself. Yet, the same brilliance that elevated her to the throne would seal her tragic fate. In a world where women were meant to obey and refuse to bow, and for that, she would pay with her life. This is not merely the story of a queen's downfall, but of a revolution born in love, faith, and betrayal. A story written in the blood-stained shadow of the Tower of London. In the shadow of the Tower of London, where ravens circle overhead like harbingers of doom, lies the story of a woman whose very existence challenged an empire and whose death would echo through the corridors of history for centuries. Anne Boleyn, a name that once whispered promises of love and power, would soon be spoken only in hushed tones of betrayal, accusation, and ultimate destruction. Her crime was not adultery, incest, or treason, as history's accusers would claim, but something far more dangerous in the eyes of Henry VIII. She had failed to provide him with the male heir he desperately craved, and in doing so had outlived her usefulness to a king who viewed women as expendable instruments of his will. The year was 1536, and England trembled under the iron fist of a monarch whose appetite for power was matched only by his capacity for cruelty. Henry VIII, the once golden prince who had ascended the throne with such promise, had transformed into a paranoid tyrant whose word was law and whose displeasure meant death. In the opulent halls of the English court, where silk and velvet masked the stench of fear, a queen was about to discover that even the highest throne could become a scaffold, and that the man who had once moved heaven and earth to make her his wife would orchestrate her destruction with the same ruthless determination. Anne Boleyn's story is not merely one of political intrigue or royal romance gone wrong. It is a testament to the brutal machinery of Tudor justice, where guilt was predetermined, evidence was fabricated, and the outcome of trials was decided in the king's private chambers rather than in courts of law. Her execution would not be a simple beheading, but a carefully orchestrated performance of state power designed to demonstrate that no one, not even a queen, was beyond Henry's reach when his interests demanded blood. The charges leveled against and were as shocking as they were unbelievable: adultery with multiple lovers, incest with her own brother, and high treason against the crown. These accusations, born not from evidence but from political necessity, would serve as the foundation for one of history's most notorious show trials. Each charge was carefully crafted to ensure not just her death, but the complete annihilation of her reputation, her family's honor, and any claim her daughter Elizabeth might have to the throne. What makes Anne Boleyn's downfall particularly chilling is not just the speed with which she fell from grace. In a matter of weeks, she went from beloved queen to condemned traitor, but the methodical precision with which her destruction was planned. Henry VIII, aided by his ruthless advisor Thomas Cromwell, constructed a web of lies so intricate that it ensnared not only but also several innocent men whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the king's mood turned murderous. The machinery of Tudor justice, once set in motion, would grind forward with unstoppable momentum, leaving devastation in its wake. The court that had once bowed before Anne Boleyn would quickly learn to avert their eyes as she was led to her doom. Courtiers who had sought her favor now distanced themselves, understanding that association with the fallen queen could prove fatal. The same nobles who had celebrated her coronation would stand silent as witnesses to her destruction, their silence purchased with the knowledge that speaking out might earn them a place beside her on the scaffold. As we delve into this dark chapter of English history, we must remember that Anne Boleyn was not merely a victim of Henry's tyranny, but a woman of remarkable intelligence, wit, and determination who had dared to challenge the established order. Her rise to power had been unprecedented, a commoner elevated to queen through sheer force of personality and the king's obsession. Her fall would be equally dramatic, serving as a warning to all who might dare to cross the Tudor monarch in the future. The execution that awaited Anne Boleyn would be conducted with all the ceremony befitting a queen. Yet its brutality lay not in the method. She would be granted the relative mercy of the sword rather than the axe, but in the cold calculation with which an innocent woman was sacrificed on the altar of Henry's political ambitions. Her death would clear the way for Jane Seymour, already waiting in the wings, and would establish a precedent that would haunt Henry's subsequent wives. In the Tudor court, Queens were as disposable as any other courtier when they failed to serve the king's purposes. The England of 1536 was a realm in the throes of unprecedented transformation, caught between the medieval world of its past and the emerging modern state that Henry VIII was determined to create. The break with Rome, precipitated by Henry's desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, had sent shockwaves throughout Europe and fundamentally altered the religious and political landscape of the kingdom. The once Catholic nation now found itself isolated from the continental powers, its king declared a heretic by the Pope, and its people struggling to adapt to new forms of worship and governance imposed from above. This religious revolution had created deep divisions within English society that extended far beyond matters of faith. The dissolution of the monasteries, begun in earnest during Anne's reign, had displaced thousands of monks and nuns while redistributing vast wealth to Henry's supporters. Ancient institutions that had provided spiritual guidance, education, and charity for centuries were swept away, their land seized, and their treasures melted down to fill the royal coffers. The social fabric of England was being rewoven according to Henry's vision, and those who had benefited from the old order found themselves increasingly marginalized and resentful. At the apex of this transformed kingdom sat Henry VIII himself, a monarch whose physical and psychological deterioration mirrored the turbulence of his realm. Once celebrated for his athletic prowess, scholarly pursuits, and charismatic personality, Henry had become increasingly paranoid, violent, and unpredictable. A jousting accident in January 1536 had left him with a leg wound that would never properly heal, causing constant pain and limiting his mobility. Some historians suggest this injury may have contributed to dramatic changes in his personality, making him more suspicious of those around him and quicker to resort to extreme measures when faced with opposition or disappointment. The king's obsession with securing a male heir had become the driving force behind virtually every political decision he made. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced only one surviving child, Princess Mary, whose gender made her an unsatisfactory successor in Henry's eyes. The entire English Reformation had been justified by Henry's need to remarry and produce a son, making Anne Boleyn's failure to deliver on this promise not just a personal disappointment, but a threat to the very legitimacy of his actions over the previous decade. The court culture that surrounded Henry had evolved into a treacherous environment where survival depended on one's ability to read the king's moods and adapt accordingly. Courtiers learned to speak in carefully coded language, never expressing opinions that might later be used against them. The slightest misstep could result in exile, imprisonment, or death. As Henry's paranoia grew and his tolerance for perceived disloyalty diminished, this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty made it easy for accusations against Anne Boleyn to find fertile ground as courtiers sought to protect themselves by joining the chorus of condemnation against the fallen queen. The economic pressures facing the kingdom also played a crucial role in Anne's downfall. Henry's extravagant lifestyle, his costly military campaigns, and the administrative expenses of governing a newly independent church had strained the royal finances to their breaking point. The wealth seized from the monasteries provided temporary relief, but Henry needed the continued support of powerful nobles and wealthy merchants to maintain his position. If these key supporters believed that Anne Boleyn had become a liability to the stability of the realm, their withdrawal of support could prove fatal to both the Queen and the King's broader agenda. International politics added another layer of complexity to Anne's precarious position. The major European powers, Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, viewed Henry's break with Rome as an opportunity to weaken England and potentially restore Catholic rule to the island nation. Anne Boleyn, as the symbol of England's religious independence, was seen by these foreign courts as a legitimate target for political intrigue. Rumors and accusations against her were eagerly spread by foreign ambassadors and agents who understood that her downfall might pave the way for England's return to the Catholic fold. The legal system that would ultimately condemn Anne Boleyn was a product of this turbulent environment, shaped by Henry's determination to maintain absolute control over his kingdom. The traditional protections afforded to members of the nobility had been steadily eroded as Henry consolidated power, and the concept of due process had been subordinated to the king's will. Courts existed not to determine truth or dispense justice, but to provide a veneer of legitimacy to decisions that had already been made in the royal chambers. This perversion of justice would become tragically apparent in the proceedings that led to Anne's execution. The physical instrument of Anne Boleyn's destruction would not be the crude executioner's axe that had severed the necks of common criminals, but a weapon of refined brutality, a sword wielded by an expert headsman imported from Calais specifically for the occasion. This seemingly merciful gesture, granted by Henry VIII in recognition of Anne's royal status, was in itself a calculated element of the psychological torture inflicted upon the condemned queen. The sword, while promising a swifter death than the axe, carried its own terrible symbolism. It was a weapon of war associated with knightly combat and honor, yet would be used to execute a woman whose alleged crime struck at the very heart of medieval concepts of feminine virtue and loyalty. The method of execution chosen for Anne Boleyn was unprecedented in English history. No queen had ever before been publicly executed, and the very act of bringing royal blood to the scaffold required careful choreography to maintain the dignity of the monarchy while simultaneously demonstrating its absolute power over life and death. The decision to use a sword rather than an axe was presented as an act of royal mercy, but it served multiple purposes. It distinguished Anne's execution from those of common traitors, it demonstrated Henry's supposed magnanimity to foreign observers, and it provided a spectacle worthy of a queen's death, one that would be remembered and discussed for generations. The executioner summoned from Calais was known as one of the most skilled in his profession, capable of severing a head with a single clean stroke that would minimize the condemned person's suffering. This expertise came at a considerable cost, both financial and symbolic. In the final days of Anne Boleyn's life, the scale of the operation to end her existence revealed just how far King Henry VIII court would go to erase her from history. The hiring of a foreign executioner and the careful orchestration of the ceremony made one thing clear: no cost would be spared in her destruction. Everything was designed not just to end a life, but to create a performance. Her death would be both spectacle and warning, a chilling reminder of royal authority that would echo through England and beyond. The scaffold was erected inside the Tower of London on Tower Green instead of the public grounds of Tower Hill. This choice was intentional. It limited the audience to select courtiers, ambassadors, and officials, witnesses who could be trusted to report only what the crown wanted the world to hear. The platform was raised high enough for all present to see, yet close enough to capture the full emotional weight of a queen's final moments. Even the timing of the execution was calculated, and was kept alive for several days after her sentencing, enduring a psychological torment worse than death itself. She was repeatedly told her execution had been postponed, then rescheduled, creating a cruel cycle of hope and despair. By the time the day finally came, she was exhausted, broken, and stripped of defiance. Her final moments were choreographed to serve the monarchy's image. She would be allowed to speak, as was customary, but her words were to be carefully monitored. No pleas of innocence would be permitted to contradict the king's narrative. Religious officials stood by to give divine legitimacy to the act, while the nobility's presence signaled full political unity behind Henry's decision, and would kneel upright, not lay her head upon a block. This position, while ensuring a clean stroke, forced her to remain conscious as she saw the executioner approach. The terror of that moment, watching death advance, was part of the punishment. When the sword finally fell, Anne's story did not end. Her body was treated with the same disregard that had marked her fall. No coffin was prepared. Instead, her remains were stuffed into an old arrow chest and buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower grounds. It was a final humiliation, an intentional erasure of her identity as queen. Anne Boleyn was not merely executed, she was meant to be forgotten. The case that brought her to this fate was a masterpiece of manipulation, engineered by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's calculating minister. Cromwell's task was to create charges shocking enough to justify her execution, yet legally sound enough to appear legitimate. The result was a series of fabrications that would shape one of the most infamous trials in English history, and was accused of adultery with multiple men, a crime considered treason for a queen. The supposed lovers included Henry Norris, the king's close friend, William Brereton, a court gentleman, Sir Francis Weston, a poet, Mark Smeaton, a musician of humble birth, and most damningly, her own brother, George Boleyn. The accusation of incest was designed to annihilate any sympathy for her. Mark Smeaton's confession, extracted under torture in Cromwell's house, became the cornerstone of the prosecution. A servant with no power or allies, Smeaton was broken under pressure. His forced admission tied the threads of the fabricated story together. Yet the alleged timeline of Anne's affairs made little sense. Some were said to have occurred while she was pregnant or recovering from childbirth. Others at times when she and the accused men were in entirely different locations. None of this mattered. The verdict had already been decided. Witnesses were bribed, threatened, or coerced into testifying. Servants were pressed to repeat rumors. Courtiers were told that their own safety depended on cooperation. The so-called evidence consisted of innocent letters and gifts twisted into symbols of betrayal. Even a piece of music dedicated to the Queen was used as proof of infidelity. Within just 3 weeks, the investigation, trial, and executions were complete, a pace that alone revealed the truth. Justice was never the goal. Those condemned alongside, and went to their deaths maintaining their innocence. Henry Norris, once among the king's most trusted companions, refused to confess even when offered mercy. His loyalty and silence were his final acts of defiance. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, addressed the crowd at his execution with measured composure, subtly exposing the injustice of his fate while stopping short of condemning the king directly. His words, "trusting in God's justice over man's," resonated as an implicit criticism of the corrupt system that had destroyed him. Anne's final days inside the Tower were marked by alternating calm and despair. Lady Kingston, the wife of the Tower's constable, described her as oscillating between laughter and tears, as though her mind were breaking under the strain. In her last recorded words, and reflected bitterly on the irony of her rise and fall. "The king has been very good to me," she said. "He raised me from a simple maid to a marchioness, then to a queen, and now he will raise me to be a martyr." Foreign diplomats who observed these events saw through the performance. Even Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador and ally of Catherine of Aragon, wrote that the case against and appeared fabricated and politically motivated. Outside England, few believed she was guilty of the crimes that ended her life. Anne's 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, would grow up in the shadow of this tragedy, the daughter of a condemned queen. Yet in time, that child would rise to rule the very kingdom that had destroyed her mother, ensuring that Anne Boleyn's name would never be forgotten. Elizabeth's silence about her mother was not born of indifference, but of deep, enduring trauma. As she grew into one of England's most formidable monarchs, the shadow of Anne Boleyn's downfall never left her. Her refusal to speak publicly about her mother, her careful evasion of questions regarding Anne's fate, and her lifelong decision to remain unmarried all were reflections of a woman shaped by the scars of betrayal and loss. The daughter of a queen branded an adulteress and traitor carried the consequences of that destruction throughout her reign. In the years following Anne's execution, the atmosphere at Henry VIII court revealed the dark undercurrents of fear and opportunism that defined Tudor politics. Courtiers who once competed for Anne's favor now rushed to condemn her, eager to display loyalty to the king. Former allies distanced themselves overnight, while her enemies, many of whom had long hidden their resentment, stepped forward to join the chorus of accusation. Anne's fall from a most powerful woman in England to a despised outcast demonstrated just how fragile power could be in Henry's world. To survive at court required not courage or conviction, but the cold instincts of self-preservation. The testimonies of those who had known and personally painted a more complex picture than the one crafted by her enemies. Beneath the political theater of her trial lay the image of an intelligent, strong-willed woman devoted to religious reform, the very reforms that had drawn Henry's attention to her years before. The accusations of infidelity made against her contradicted everything known about her character and faith. For a queen who had reached the pinnacle of influence, the idea of risking everything for reckless affairs was absurd. Yet reason held no power against royal will. When Anne Boleyn was brought to trial in the Tower of London on May 15, 1536, the outcome was already written. It was not a trial, it was a performance. Her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, presided, proving that in Henry's England, family loyalty meant nothing when weighed against royal favor. The 26 peers who judged her were all men dependent on the king's goodwill, ensuring that none dared to defy him. The charges were sweeping adultery, treason, conspiracy, even mocking the king's clothes. From deadly crimes to petty slights, the list was designed to overwhelm her and justify a sentence already decided. Despite the futility, Anne defended herself with remarkable composure. Her words were measured and sharp, exposing contradictions in the prosecution's case. But her intelligence, once her greatest strength now, worked against her, interpreted as manipulation by those who had already condemned her. The breaking point came when the court produced the coerced confession of Mark Smeaton. Witnesses recalled Anne's visible shock, her disbelief at the betrayal. She was denied the right to question her accuser, denied even the most basic fairness. The proceedings, rushed and hollow, lasted only a few hours. The haste itself was proof of guilt, according to her judges, though in truth it only revealed the weakness of their evidence. When the verdict was delivered, each of the 26 peers pronounced and guilty with robotic precision. Only Henry Percy, who had once loved her, faltered as the words left his lips. The sentence was death by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Henry alone would decide the manner of her end, his power absolute. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, once raised by Anne's favor, now annulled her marriage in secret, legitimizing Henry's swift union with Jane Seymour and branding Elizabeth a bastard. In Henry's England, loyalty was survival, and survival demanded submission. Across Europe, the world watched in disgust. Ambassadors wrote home describing the trial as a sham, a brutal charade staged to rid Henry of an inconvenient wife. Even among Catholic powers who despised and for breaking with Rome, the spectacle stained England's reputation. It showed the terrifying reach of a king who could twist the law itself into an instrument of vengeance. On the morning of May 19, 1536, the sky over the Tower of London was gray and heavy. Anne Boleyn awoke knowing it would be her last dawn. In the days before, she had been toyed with told mercy might yet come, only for hope to be snatched away again. That cruel game had broken many before her, but faced her end with calm resolve. Dressed in a gray damask gown and a white coif, she took care that nothing would hinder the executioner's work. Her last acts were simple. She gave away her few possessions to her attendants and whispered thanks to those who had remained with her. Even in death, she would not allow them to see her undone. The small procession moved toward the scaffold. Sir William Kingston led the way, followed by the handful of women brave enough to stand beside their queen. Around them, 1,000 spectators, nobles, ambassadors, and citizens waited in tense silence. The French executioner, brought at great cost to ensure a swift death, stood ready with his long sword. Every detail of the scene had been arranged to project royal authority, even in murder. Anne's final words were recorded by several witnesses. She asked those present to pray for the king, calling him a gracious and merciful sovereign. It was not submission, it was strategy. She knew that defiance, even now, could endanger her daughter. Moments later, she knelt upright, hands bound, her eyes covered. The executioner's sword flashed once. The blow was so swift that her lips were still moving in prayer when her head fell. There was no ceremony, no coffin. Her body was placed in a rough elm chest meant for arrows and buried without a marker inside the tower grounds. A queen reduced to silence and dust. Within hours, Henry's court moved on as though nothing had happened. Plans for his marriage to Jane Seymour began immediately. The courtiers who had betrayed and now served her successor with the same eager smiles. The machinery of power turned smoothly, indifferent to the blood it consumed. Anne Boleyn's death was more than a personal tragedy, it was a lesson in the cost of power under tyranny. And though her body was erased, her legacy endured in her daughter, Elizabeth, who would rise to rule England with the same intelligence, will, and unbreakable spirit that had once defined her doomed mother.